The crystal chandeliers of the Sterling Gala were meant to illuminate success, yet they only cast long, jagged shadows over Elena's trembling hands as she gripped the glass. Beside her stood Julian, the man she vowed to love, now the man she blamed for her stagnation, wiping a stain from his fraying cuff while the city's elite whispered behind their champagne flutes. It was a picture-perfect disaster. A desperate wife, a seemingly incompetent husband, and a secret that was about to drown them both in regret. If the anatomy of a marriage crumbling under the weight of ambition and silence intrigues you, perhaps you should stay. There are truths hidden in these hallways that are far more dangerous than the lies, and we are just beginning to unlock the door. The steam from the shower had long since dissipated, leaving the bathroom mirror streaked and cold. Julian stood before it, adjusting the knot of his tie. It was a simple black tie, slightly frayed at the edges, a relic from a life he pretended to live. "Are you wearing that?" Elena's voice cut through the hum of the ventilation fan. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the harsh hallway light. She was beautiful, undeniably so, in a floor-length emerald gown that hugged her frame. But her face was tight with a specific kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. Julian met her eyes in the reflection. He didn't turn around. "It's the only one I have, El." "It looks cheap," she said, walking into the small room and brushing past him to check her lipstick. She didn't mean to be cruel. Or perhaps she did. The line had blurred months ago. "Tonight isn't just a party, Julian. The board is watching. My father is already texting me asking if we're bringing the car around or if we're taking the subway like us." "We can take a cab," Julian offered, his voice low and even. He was used to this tone, the sharp, frantic rhythm of her anxiety. "A cab," she scoffed, capping her lipstick with a sharp click. "Do you know who's going to be there? The CEO of Sterling Global, the phantom owner everyone talks about but no one has seen. If I get 5 minutes with the executive team, I could secure the VP spot. I could finally get my parents off my back. I can't roll up in a yellow taxi smelling like old leather in rain." Julian turned then, reaching out to touch her bare shoulder. His fingers were warm, steady. "You're good at what you do, Elena. You don't need a limousine to prove that. They know your numbers." She flinched, pulling away subtly. It was a small movement, barely an inch, but it felt like a canyon opening between them. "Numbers don't matter in this world, Julian. Perception matters. And right now, the perception is that I'm married to a man who hasn't contributed to the rent in 6 months." The air in the bathroom grew heavy. Julian lowered his hand. He wanted to tell her. The words were right there, sitting on his tongue like a heavy stone. "I own the building we're going to. I own the company that signs your paychecks. I own the debt your father racked up." He had started this charade 3 years ago to escape the sycophants, to find someone who didn't care about the Sterling name. And he had found Elena. She had been fierce, independent, and kind. But the city, the grind, and her parasitic family had ground that softness out of her. "I finished the manuscript today, Julian. The advance should come through next week." Elena looked at him, her eyes pitying and tired. "That's great, Julian. Really. But an advance on a niche novel won't pay for the membership at the club my dad insists we join to network." She checked her phone, the screen lighting up her face with a harsh blue glow. A barrage of notifications cascaded down the glass. "Mom, make sure he doesn't drink too much. Dad, need to talk to you about the loan extension. Find me at the buffet. Lucas, can you get me an invite to the after party?" She sighed. A ragged sound. "Let's just go. Please, Julian. Just stay in the background tonight. Don't try to talk about politics or art. Just nod and smile. Can you do that for me?" Julian tightened his tie one last time. The cheap fabric felt like a noose. He looked at the woman he loved,
seeing the terror behind her ambition. She was terrified of being ordinary. She was terrified of him driving her back into the mediocrity she fought so hard to escape. "I'll be invisible," Julian promised. He grabbed his worn jacket from a hook. As he followed her out of their cramped apartment, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it, but he knew who it was. The chairman of the board asking if Mr. Sterling would be attending the gala tonight to finally take his rightful place. Julian looked at Elena's tense back as she jobbed the elevator button repeatedly. "Yes," he whispered to the empty hallway. "I think I will."
The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a cavern of gold leaf and velvet, humming with the murmur of $1 billion in net worth. The air smelled of expensive perfume, chilled champagne, and the metallic tang of ambition. For Elena, it felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been written, but she was still desperate to make her case. She tightened her grip on Julian's arm as they stepped off the red carpet and into the foyer. Her knuckles were white. Julian felt the tremor in her hand, a vibration of pure nerves that traveled through the fabric of his worn tuxedo jacket. "Remember," Elena whispered, her eyes darting around the room, scanning for faces that mattered. "The VP of Operations, Marcus Thorne, is near the bar. Don't look at him. If he sees you, he'll ask what you do, and I can't have you telling him you're between projects. Just go find a drink and stay near the edge." Julian looked at the room. He recognized the floral arrangements. He had approved the budget for them 6 months ago via a blind email chain. He recognized the security details standing by the pillars. They were his men, instructed to ignore him tonight unless he gave the signal. It was a surreal, out-of-body experience to walk unrecognized through his own kingdom, treated like a peasant at the gate. "I'll be fine, El," Julian said, his voice calm amidst the din. "Go do what you need to do." Before he could pull away, a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. It wasn't a friendly pat. It was a claim of ownership. "Well, look who decided to show up. The rider." Elena stiffened. She turned to find her father, Robert, and her brother, Lucas, standing there. They were both employed in mid-level logistics at Sterling Global, jobs Elena had begged to get them. They held tumblers of scotch that were far too full for this early in the evening. "Dad, please, not now," Elena said, her voice tight. Robert ignored her, his watery eyes fixing on Julian with a sneer. "I hope you didn't pay for that suit, son. It looks like you rented it from a funeral home." Lucas snickered, adjusting his own silk tie, a tie likely bought with money borrowed from Elena. "Come on, Dad. He's an artist. Suffering is part of the aesthetic, right? Meanwhile, Elle is working 80-hour weeks to keep the lights on." Julian met his father-in-law's gaze. In the boardroom, Julian was known as a shark, ruthless, efficient, and terrifyingly quiet. But here, bound by his promise to Elena and the undercover life he had chosen, he had to play the prey. "Good to see you too, Robert," Julian said dryly. "Elena," Robert snapped, turning his attention to his daughter. "I heard a rumor. They say the chairman is actually coming tonight, the ghost himself. If he's here, you need to get FaceTime, and you can't do it with him hanging off your arm." He jerked his head toward Julian. "Park him at the buffet. Lucas and I need to introduce you to the regional directors." Elena looked at Julian. For a second, he saw the apology in her eyes, the flicker of love that was slowly being suffocated by shame. But then she looked at her father, at the looming threat of their disappointment, and the love vanished. "Julian, maybe just wait by the terrace. I'll come find you in 20 minutes. It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal. "Of course," Julian said. He unhooked his arm from hers. The loss of contact felt final. As Elena was swept away by her father and brother, who were already loudly complaining about the quality of the scotch, Julian drifted toward the periphery of the room. He watched them go. He watched how Elena's posture changed when she approached the executives, her spine straightening, her smile widening into something practiced and brittle. She was performing for her life.
Mr. Vance. The voice was low, coming from his left. Julian didn't turn his head immediately. He knew the voice. It was Arthur Penhaligon, the company's chief legal officer and one of the 3 people on Earth who knew Julian's true identity. Julian took a sip of water from a passing tray. "Not here, Arthur." "Sir," Arthur whispered, stepping up beside him, pretending to look at the crowd. "The board is getting restless. They see you here. They want to know when you're going to announce the restructuring. The stock is wobbling." "Let it wobble," Julian murmured, his eyes still locked on his wife across the room. She was laughing at a joke Marcus Thorne had made, a laugh that sounded terrified. "I'm watching something." "Watching what, sir?" "I'm watching to see if my marriage can survive my money, or if the lack of it is the only thing holding it together." Across the room, the atmosphere shifted. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling the beginning of the speeches. Waiters began to swarm out of the kitchen with heavy trays, weaving through the crowded clusters of guests. Julian saw Elena near the VIP section. She looked trapped. Her father was whispering angrily in her ear, gesturing toward the head table. Her brother was leaning against a pillar, looking bored and unsteady. Julian felt a knot of tension in his chest. He moved away from Arthur, instinctively stepping closer to where his wife stood. He didn't know why, but the air around her felt charged, volatile. He could see the stress radiating off her, like heat waves. He was the owner of all of this, the crystal, the wine, the company, the future, but as he walked toward her, he realized he was powerless to stop the crash that was coming. He was just a spectator in a tragedy he had inadvertently written. And then he saw the waiter with the cart full of dirty dishes, turning the corner, heading straight for the cluster of people where Elena stood, blind to the obstacle in his path.
The crash was not loud, but in the finely tuned acoustics of the ballroom, it sounded like a gunshot. Julian had seen it happen in slow motion. The young busboy, barely 20, had been maneuvering a heavy cart laden with clear dinner plates and half-empty wine glasses. The cart's wheel had caught on the edge of the thick Persian rug, just as Marcus Thorne, the VP of operations, took a step backward. Julian had moved instinctively. He lunged forward, his hand shooting out to steady the teetering cart. He caught the metal railing, preventing the entire load from cascading onto Thorne's pristine tuxedo. However, the sudden stop caused a single crystal goblet to slide off the top tray. It hit the floor with a sharp shatter, sending shards skittering across the polished wood. Silence rippled outward from the impact zone. Julian stood there, one hand on the cart, the other hovering in the air. He was the hero of the moment, having saved the VP from a deluge of marinara sauce and grease. But that wasn't how it looked to the room. To the onlookers, it looked like a man in a cheap suit had just crashed into the service staff. "For God's sake," Lucas's voice cut through the quiet, loud and sneering. "He's drunk. I told you he was drinking before we got here." Elena turned. The blood drained from her face. She saw Julian standing amidst the broken glass, his hand on the service card. She saw Marcus Thorne brushing a microscopic speck of dust from his sleeve, looking annoyed. But mostly, she saw the eyes of the board of directors shifting toward her. The panic that had been simmering in her gut all week boiled over. It was a physical sensation, a hot, blinding white noise that drowned out logic. In her mind, the promotion was gone. Her father's mortgage was in default. Her life was collapsing, and the man standing there, the deadweight, was the cause. She didn't think. She crossed the distance between them in 4 sharp strides, her heels clicking like a countdown. "Elena," Julian started, his voice calm, ready to explain. "I just caught—" "Shut up," she hissed, her voice trembling with a rage that terrified even her. "Just shut up, Julian. You ruin everything. You always ruin everything." She looked at the busboy's cart. Sitting on the bottom shelf was a large, clear plastic pitcher used for the slops, the gray, murky mixture of melted ice, leftover wine, and dregs of coffee collected from the tables.
It was repulsive. It was filth. And in that moment, looking at Julian's calm, almost pitying expression, she wanted to hurt him. She wanted to separate herself from him so violently that no one would ever connect the name Vance to her rising star again. She grabbed the handle of the pitcher. It was heavy, sloshing with the cold, dirty liquid. "Elena, don't," Julian said. He didn't move away. He didn't raise his hands to protect himself. He just looked at her, his dark eyes wide with a realization that was far more painful than anger. "I am done with you," she announced, her voice pitching up so the room could hear. "I am done cleaning up your messes." With a heave of effort, she swung the pitcher forward. The liquid arc was sluggish and gray. It hit Julian squarely on the chest and splashed up into his face. The smell of stale alcohol and cold grease instantly filled the air. The dirty water soaked into his cheap tuxedo, dripping from his chin, plastering his hair to his forehead. A piece of soggy lemon rind clung to his lapel. The ballroom gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room. Elena stood there, the empty pitcher dangling from her hand, her chest heaving. She expected to feel relief. She expected to feel powerful, like she had finally cut the anchor loose. Instead, she felt a sudden, terrifying coldness. Julian stood perfectly still. He didn't wipe the water from his eyes, he didn't sputter or curse. He just stood there, dripping, dignified in a way that made the silence unbearable. The water pooled around his worn shoes, staining the expensive rug. He looked at her. Really looked at her. It wasn't the look of a husband looking at a wife. It was the look of a judge delivering a verdict. "Is that what you needed?" Julian asked softly. His voice was steady, carrying through the dead silence of the room. Elena's hand trembled, and she dropped the pitcher. It clattered on the floor, rolling in a circle. "You don't belong here," she whispered, though the conviction was already leaking out of her voice, replaced by a dawning horror. You're just an embarrassment." Julian nodded slowly. He reached into his soaked pocket, retrieved a soggy napkin, and dabbed the corner of his mouth. "You're right, Elena. I don't belong here." He turned his back on her. But before the security guards could step forward to escort the drunk out of the ballroom, a commanding voice boomed from the entrance of the ballroom, stopping everyone in their tracks. "Mr. Sterling?" The crowd parted.
The name hung in the air, heavier than the silence that had preceded it. Mr. Sterling. Elena blinked, her mind refusing to process the sound. She assumed the voice was addressing someone behind her, perhaps the reclusive CEO she had been desperate to meet all evening. She turned, expecting to see a distinguished older gentleman stepping out of the shadows. But there was only the crowd, parted like the Red Sea, and walking down the center of the aisle was indeed a distinguished man, Elias Thorne, the current chairman of the board of Sterling Global. He was a man Elena had only seen in company newsletters and on the cover of Forbes. He was the definition of power, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his tuxedo impeccable. He was walking straight toward the puddle of dirty dishwater. "Sir," Elena stammered, stepping forward, her instinct to manage the situation kicking in despite her terror. She gestured frantically at security, who were hesitating near the walls. "I am so sorry. My husband, he's clearly unwell. We were just leaving. Please don't let this ruin the evening." Elias Thorne didn't look at her. He didn't even seem to register her existence. His eyes were locked entirely on the man dripping with gray sludge. Elias stopped right at the edge of the spill. He didn't recoil from the smell. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a pristine white silk handkerchief. With a bow that was not mocking, but deeply, terrifyingly respectful, he extended it. "I believe you might need this, sir," Elias said. Julian looked at the handkerchief. Then he looked at Elias. The expression on Julian's face shifted. The look of the weary, beaten-down husband evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp authority that Elena had never seen before. It was as if a mask had been peeled away, revealing steel underneath.
Julian took the handkerchief. He wiped the dirty water from his brow with a slow, deliberate motion. "Thank you, Elias," Julian said. His voice was different now. It wasn't the soft mumble he used in their apartment. It was the voice of a man who was used to being listened to. "I apologize for the disruption. It seems my disguise was a bit too convincing tonight." Elena let out a short, hysterical laugh. "Disguise? Julian, what are you talking about? Elias, please, he's—" "Mrs. Vance." Elias cut her off. For the first time, the chairman looked at her. His gaze was glacial. "I would advise you to lower your voice when speaking to the owner of this company." The world tilted on its axis. Elena felt the blood drain from her extremities. Her hands went numb. "Owner? No, you're mistaken. This is Julian Vance. He's a writer. I pay the rent." "His name," Elias enunciated every syllable, "is Julian Sterling, the sole heir and majority shareholder of Sterling Global, and for the past 3 years he has been evaluating the integrity of those he entrusted with his legacy." A murmur ripped through the crowd. Phones were raised. The flash of cameras began to pop, blinding and rapid. Elena looked at Julian. She looked for the lie, for the joke. But she saw only the truth she had been too blind to see. The way he knew the flower budget. The way he never worried about money despite having none. The way he had asked her time and time again if she loved him or the life she wanted him to provide. "Julian?" she whispered. Julian finally turned to her. He was still wet, his hair plastered to his skull, his cheap suit ruined. But he looked taller than anyone in the room. "I told you I'd stay in the background, Elena. I tried to be invisible for you, but you couldn't just let me be a husband. You needed me to be a prop." He dropped the soiled silk handkerchief onto the floor. It landed with a soft, wet thud next to the plastic pitcher. "Clean this up," Julian said to the room at large. He wasn't speaking to the busboy. "Right away, Mr. Sterling." Marcus Thorne, the man Elena had been trying to impress all night, rushed forward, signaling to the staff with a frantic wave of his hand. Julian turned and began to walk toward the exit. The board of directors, men and women who earned 7 figures a year, fell into step behind him, forming a phalanx of wealth and power that shielded him from the crowd. Elena took a step to follow him, but her legs refused to move. She was frozen in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the shattered glass and the puddle of filth that she had created. Her father and brother stood by the buffet table, their mouths hanging open, their drinks forgotten. As Julian reached the double doors, he didn't look back. He didn't check to see if she was okay. He pushed the doors open and walked out into the cold New York night, leaving Elena Vance standing alone under the $1,000,000 chandeliers, drowning in the open air.
The taxi ride back to Queens was the longest 40 minutes of Elena's life. She sat in the back of the yellow cab, her emerald gown bunched up around her knees, shivering despite the heating blasting from the vents. Her phone sat in her lap like a grenade she was afraid to touch. It had buzzed incessantly for the first 10 minutes, calls from her father, texts from Lucas, a missed call from Marcus Thorne, but now it was ominous and dark. When the cab pulled up to their pre-war apartment building, the windows were dark. Usually, Julian left the hallway light on for her, a small gesture, a lighthouse he called it, to guide her home after late nights at the office. Tonight, the window was a black square against the brick. Elena paid the driver with shaking hands and climbed at 3 flights of stairs. Her key scraped against the lock, a harsh, metallic sound in the quiet hallway. She pushed the door open. "Julian?" Her voice cracked. The apartment smelled the same, old paper, coffee, and her lavender fabric softener, but the air felt thin, evacuated. She walked into the bedroom. The bed was made, the duvet pulled tight, military style. She opened the closet. It wasn't that he had taken everything. It was what he had left behind that hurt more. The shirts she had bought him for birthdays, the ties she had picked out because they looked professional, the watch she had given him with the inscription, "Time to get serious." They were all there, arranged neatly on the shelves. What was missing was him.
His worn leather journal was gone from the nightstand. His toothbrush was gone from the bathroom cup. The old soft gray hoodie he wore when he wrote, the one she hated because it had holes in the cuffs, was gone. He had taken only what was his, leaving behind everything she had used to try and mold him into someone else. Elena sank onto the edge of the bed, the silence pressing against her ears. She waited for tears, but she was too dehydrated from fear to cry. She fell asleep in her gown, curling up on top of the covers, waiting for the sound of the front door opening. It never did. The morning sun was cruel. It sliced through the blinds with a blinding clarity that offered no comfort. Elena woke up with a headache that throbbed behind her eyes. For a split second, she thought it was just a bad dream, but the stain of dirty water on the hem of her dress threw the reality back into focus. She showered, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, trying to wash off the feeling of the ballroom. She put on her armor, a charcoal suit, heels, diamond studs, and went to work. She didn't know what else to do. If she stopped moving, she would shatter. Sterling Global headquarters was a fortress of glass and steel in Midtown. Usually, Elena walked through the lobby with her head high, scanning her badge with efficient speed. Today, the walk from the revolving doors to the elevator bank felt like a gauntlet. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes followed her. They weren't looking at her with the usual mixture of envy and respect. They were looking at her like she was a ghost, or perhaps a curiosity in a museum. The woman who poured water on the owner. She made it to her office on the 40th floor and closed the door, leaning her forehead against the cool wood. Her office phone rang. She stared at it. It wasn't the internal line. It was an outside call. Hello? Elena! Her father's voice was high-pitched, bordering on hysteria. My badge isn't working. I'm in the lobby. Lucas is here too. Security won't let us up. They said our clearance has been revoked. Elena felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Dad, calm down. It's probably a glitch. The system resets sometimes. It's not a glitch, Robert screamed. We tried to log into our email from home. Locked out. Access denied. Elena, fix this. Go tell him to fix this. Before she could answer, a notification pinged on her computer screen. A company-wide email. From Office of the Chairman. Subject: Strategic Restructuring and Personnel Changes. Elena's hands trembled as she clicked the mouse. The email was concise, brutal, and devoid of emotion. It announced an immediate restructuring of the logistics and support departments to eliminate redundancies and improve operational integrity. Attached was a list of terminated positions. She scrolled down. There they were. Her father's role, Senior Logistics Coordinator. Her brother's role, Supply Chain Associate. Her cousin's role in mailroom operations. Everyone. Every single member of her family who had been drawing a paycheck from Sterling Global thanks to her nepotism was gone. Effective immediately. Severance packages were minimal, strictly adhering to the state minimum. But her name was not on the list. She sat back on her ergonomic chair, the breath leaving her lungs. Julian wasn't firing her. He had surgically removed the parasites that she had been carrying on her back for years. He had done exactly what she'd claimed she wanted to do 1,000 times in her head, but never had the courage to execute. Elena, are you there? My father was still screaming on the phone. They're escorting us out. Do something. You're his wife, for Christ's sake. I don't think I am anymore. What? I don't think I'm his wife anymore, Dad. She hung up the phone. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of her office door. A single envelope slid underneath, gliding across the carpet and stopping at the toe of her high heel. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The return address was a law firm I recognized, the most expensive, ruthless firm in the city. Elena stared at the envelope. The office outside was buzzing with the news of the mass firings, the hive mind of the corporate world dissecting the sudden slaughter. But in her office, it was quiet. She realized then that Julian wasn't coming back to the apartment to argue. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to demand an apology. He had simply moved to a higher altitude where the air was too thin for her to breathe, and he was cutting the ropes.
She reached down and picked up the envelope.
The envelope contained a petition for divorce. It was standard, sterile, and terrifyingly fair. There were no demands for alimony, no vindictive clauses about mental anguish, though he certainly had the grounds for it. It was a clean break, a business transaction concluding a failed venture. Elena didn't sign it. Instead, she marched to the elevator bank. Her destination was the 50th floor, the executive penthouse. In her 5 years at Sterling Global, she had never been above the 42nd floor. The 50th was a myth, a silent level that required a specific black key card that only board members possessed. When she pressed the button, nothing happened. The light didn't blink, the doors didn't close. She stood there, jamming her finger against the plastic button, her reflection in the polished steel doors mocking her. She was the director of marketing, she was his wife, and she was stuck in the lobby of his life, unable to ascend. Miss Vance? A security guard, a man she had nodded to every morning for years, stepped forward. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I'm sorry, ma'am. That floor is restricted. You need an escort." "I am his wife, Gary," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "I know, ma'am, but orders are orders. I can call up for you." 10 minutes later, Elena found herself standing in an elevator she had never seen before. It was lined with walnut wood and smelled of citrus and leather. She wasn't alone. A silent, stone-faced assistant accompanied her, holding a tablet as if it were a weapon. The doors opened directly into a reception area that felt more like a modern art gallery than an office. The walls were glass, offering a panoramic 360-degree view of Manhattan. The city looked small from up here. The people looked like ants. "Is this how he sees us now?" Elena wondered. "Mr. Sterling has 15 minutes before his conference call with Tokyo," the assistant said, gesturing toward a set of double doors. Elena walked through them. The office was vast. At the far end, behind a desk that looked like a slab of obsidian, sat Julian. He was on the phone, speaking in fluent, rapid-fire Japanese. He didn't look up when she entered. He was wearing a suit that she had never seen, a charcoal three-piece that fit him with architectural precision. His hair was styled back, revealing the sharp angles of his face. He looked cleaner, harder, and infinitely more dangerous than the man who used to make her toast in the morning. He finished the call and placed the receiver gently down. Only then did he look at her. "Hello, Elena." There was no warmth, no anger, just a neutral acknowledgement of her presence. "You fired my family." It wasn't what she meant to say. She wanted to say, "I'm sorry." She wanted to say, "Come home." But the defense mechanism was hardwired deep. "I terminated employees who were underqualified and overcompensated," Julian corrected, leaning back in his chair. "It was a fiduciary responsibility. I couldn't very well restructure the Asia division while ignoring the rot in my own backyard." "Rot?" Elena stepped forward, her heels sinking into the plush carpet. "They are my family, Julian. They treated you like a parasite?" Julian finished for her. He stood up and walked to the window, turning his back to her. "They treated me like a leech because they projected their own nature onto me. They were the ones draining the company, Elena. I just closed the tap." "You could have told me," she whispered. "Why didn't you tell me? 3 years, Julian. You lied to me for 3 years." He turned around. The sunlight framed him in a halo of white light, making it hard to see his expression. "I didn't lie. I omitted. I told you I was a writer. I am a writer. I write the corporate strategy for a Fortune 500 company. I told you I had family money. I never said how much. But you never asked the right questions, Elena. You were too busy apologizing for me. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I could buy. And I found out exactly how much you loved Julian Vance. You loved him enough to marry him, but not enough to respect him, not enough to stand by him when world was watching. I was scared, Elena admitted, the tears finally spilling over. I was scared of losing everything, the promotion, the house, the respect. And now? Julian asked. Now I've lost you. Yes, Julian said. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that probably cost more than her father's house. You have the papers. The terms are generous. You keep the apartment. You keep your job if you wish to stay. I don't believe in punishing competence, and you are good at your job, Elena. But we are done. The assistant appeared in the doorway, silent as a shadow. Mr. Sterling, Tokyo is on line 1. Julian nodded. He looked at Elena one last time. It was a look of finality, like closing a book he had finished reading long ago. Goodbye, Elena. He sat back down at his desk and pressed a button on the phone, instantly switching back into a world she couldn't understand. The assistant held the door open. Elena turned and walked out, the silence of the glass tower ringing in her ears louder than any scream.
Elena didn't sign the papers. Not yet. Instead, she used the last shred of her access, a favor called in from a terrified former assistant of Julian's, to find out where he was sleeping. It wasn't a hotel. It was the penthouse of the Sterling residence on Park Avenue, a building she had walked past 1,000 times, admiring the architecture, never knowing her husband held the deed to the skyline. It was late, past midnight, when the private elevator opened directly into the foyer. She expected security to stop her, but the doors slid open to reveal Julian sitting on a sprawling leather sofa, illuminated only by the glow of the city grid outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. He held a tumbler of amber liquid, staring at the Empire State Building as if it were an old adversary. He didn't look surprised to see her. "The doorman called up," Julian said, his voice quiet, absorbed by the vast acoustic stillness of the room. "I told him to let you up. I figured you wouldn't settle for the office." Elena stepped into the room. It was cold, beautiful, and utterly devoid of the clutter that defined their life in Queens. There were no piles of unpaid bills, no half-read paperbacks, no chipped mugs. It was a space designed for a man who needed nothing. "Is this who you really are?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly. She gestured around the room. "The suits, the penthouse, the ice in your veins? Was the man I lived with for 3 years just a character? A role you played to laugh at me?" Julian took a sip of his drink. "I never laughed at you, Elena. I lived with you. I struggled with you. I ate the same stale pasta and worried about the same heating bills. I didn't touch the trust fund. I wanted to know what it felt like to build a life, not just inherit one." "But you had a parachute," she countered, walking closer, her heels sinking into the deep-piled rug. "You always knew you could pull the cord if it got too hard. I didn't. I was falling without a net, Julian. That's why I was so scared. That's why I pushed you." "I know," he said. He finally turned to look at her. His eyes were tired. "I know you were scared. That's why I waited." He reached toward the coffee table. Sitting there, stark against the dark wood, was a small velvet box. It wasn't a ring box. It was larger, rectangular. "Open it," he said. Elena sat on the edge of the adjacent armchair. Her hands shook as she reached for the box. Inside was not jewelry, but a key. A heavy, old-fashioned brass key. And beneath it, a folded piece of stationery with the Sterling Global letterhead. "Read the date." She unfolded the letter. It was dated the morning of the gala. "Draft press release. Immediate. Release. Sterling Global announces the return of Julian Sterling as CEO. Furthermore, the board is pleased to appoint Elena Vance as the new Chief Operations Officer, recognizing her tireless dedication and talent." Elena stopped reading. Her breath hitched in her throat, a painful, sharp intake of air. "I was going to tell you that night," Julian said softly. "The gala was the finish line. I had proven to myself that I could survive without the name, and I wanted to give you the world, Elena. Not because you asked for it, but because I thought you had earned it by standing next to a nobody." He swirled the ice in his glass. "I had the key to this place in my pocket. I was going to bring you here after the party. I was going to tell you that the struggle was over, that we had won." Elena dropped the letter. It fluttered to the floor, landing next to the brass key. The irony was a physical blow. She had destroyed him, publicly, violently, moments before he was about to elevate her to the very position she had sold her soul to achieve. "You tested me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It was a test. It didn't start as one. But in the end, yes. And you failed, Elle. Not because you were ambitious. I love your ambition. You failed because when the pressure hit, you didn't look at me and see a partner. You saw a stain. You saw something to be wiped away. I was panicked. It was the water, the crowd, my father." "It wasn't the water," he corrected her gently. "It was the contempt. I saw it in your eyes, Elena. You hated me in that moment. You hated me for being weak, for being useless. And that's something money can't fix. If I take you back now, I'll always wonder, do you love me or do you love the chairman?" Elena looked at him. She wanted to scream that she loved him, that she missed the man in the gray hoodie. But the words died in her throat. Because she knew, deep down, that if he were still just Julian Vance, the struggling writer who spilled drinks at parties, she would still be ashamed of him. She stood up. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it was an ocean. "I'm sorry," she said. It was the only thing left to say. "I know," Julian said. He didn't stand up to walk her to the door. "Keep the apartment in Queens. I paid the rent for the next 5 years. Consider it a severance package for the years you lost waiting for me to grow up." Elena turned and walked toward the elevator. She pressed the button, and as the door slid shut, she saw Julian turn back to the window, watching the city that belonged to him, alone, in his glass tower.
1 year later, the view from the CEO's office at Sterling Global was breathtaking. From the 45th floor, the city looked like a circuit board of gold and steel, humming with an energy that Elena now controlled. She adjusted the cuffs of her silk blouse, the fabric cool against her skin. Her calendar was full. Her bank account was healthy enough to buy her father's house 3 times over, though she hadn't spoken to him since the day the locks were changed. She had learned her lesson well. Dead weight must be cut, ruthlessly and without apology. In many ways, she had become the person she thought Julian needed to be: efficient, cold, untouchable. "Miss Vance?" Her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The car is waiting downstairs for the foundation gala, and Mr. Thorne sent up the quarterly projections you asked for. Leave them on the desk. I'm leaving now." She picked up her clutch. It was a Judith Lieber, sparkling with thousands of crystals. A year ago, she would have killed for this bag. Now it just felt heavy. The gala was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Temple of Dendur was bathed in soft amber light, reflecting off the water of the decorative pool. The atmosphere was hushed and reverent, a far cry from the chaotic noise of the Sterling party where her life had fractured. Elena moved through the crowd with practiced ease. Men who had once looked through her now nodded with respect. Women who had sneered at her cheap department store dresses now asked who her stylist was. She was Elena Vance, the woman who had helped steer Sterling Global through its most profitable quarter in a decade. She was a success story. She took a glass of champagne from a passing tray, not because she wanted it, but because it gave her hands something to do.
She stood near the edge of the sandstone temple, watching the elite mingle. Then she saw him. Julian was standing near the Egyptian exhibit, laughing. It wasn't the polite, guarded laugh she remembered from their last months together. It was a full, rich sound that seemed to bubble up from his chest. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a simple dark suit, unbuttoned at the collar, relaxed in a way she had never allowed him to be. He wasn't alone. A woman stood next to him. She wasn't a model, nor was she a socialite dripping in diamonds. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. She held a book in one hand, Julian's new novel, Elena realized with a jolt. And she was looking at him with an expression that stopped Elena's breath. It was a look of total, unadulterated adoration. And more importantly, it was a look of understanding. She was listening to him speak, her head tilted, absorbed in his words, not scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. Julian said something, and the woman touched his arm. He covered her hand with his own. The gesture was so intimate, so easy that Elena felt like an intruder just by watching. A waiter passed by, and Julian turned slightly to decline a drink. In doing so, his gaze swept across the room. For a heartbeat, his eyes locked with Elena's. The air between them didn't crackle with electricity, there was no sudden rush of wind, no cinematic swelling of violins. There was just a quiet, dull thud in Elena's chest. Julian didn't look angry, he didn't look sad. He looked fine. He nodded to her. A polite, acknowledging nod, the kind one gives to a former colleague or a distant acquaintance. And then, without hesitation, he turned back to the woman in the navy dress, returning to his conversation, returning to his life. Elena stood frozen, gripping her crystal clutch until her knuckles turned white. She had won. She had the job, the money, the respect. She had proven to the world that she was more than just a girl from Queens with a messy family. She had climbed the mountain. But standing there, watching Julian smile at a woman who loved him for the man in the fraying hoodie, Elena realized the terrible truth of that night at the plaza. She hadn't poured dirty water on him to clean him up. She hadn't washed away his disguise. The water had splashed off him, leaving him untouched, pure in his intent and his character. It was Elena who had been washed away. The water had swept her out of his life, clearing the space for someone who deserved him. "Miss Vance," a board member approached her, holding out a hand. "Wonderful evening, isn't it? I heard the projections for Q4 are spectacular." Elena tore her eyes away from the couple. She forced the corners of her mouth into the sharp, perfect smile that had become her trademark. It felt like a mask of glass, ready to shatter. "Yes," Elena said, her voice steady, though the inside of her felt like a hollowed-out ruin. "Spectacular." She turned her back on Julian Sterling and walked toward the board member, stepping deeper into the cold, bright light of her success, entirely and utterly alone.